afternoon, everyone. I'm Martha Gilmer. I'm the CEO of the San Diego Symphony Orchestra, and thank you for joining us today inside Jacobs Music Center series, where we can talk about the renovation of our beloved indoor hall, and today especially about the acoustical renovation. I'm joined today by Principal Architect John Frayne and acoustician Paul Scarborough. Thank you for being with us today. Paul and I met several years ago when he was completing work on the Smith Center, a brand new concert hall in Las Vegas. And I was there for the initial performances and tuning, initial rehearsals, the initial sound of that hall. And we've kept in touch through the years. Paul has many accomplishments since that, including a renovation of a hall in Cincinnati, a renovation of a hall in Milwaukee, and of course, just a few weeks ago, the opening of the Geffen Hall, New York Phil's home in New York, which by all acclaim is a great success, Paul. Congratulations. I know that's a great relief. This is an important milestone in the life of that orchestra, which is going to make such a big difference. So welcome, and maybe tell us a little bit about those projects, and then we'll go to how that relates to what we're doing.
Sure. Well, thank you, Martha. It's great to be here. Geffen Hall has obviously been an amazing experience. Working with Lincoln Center and the New York Philharmonic has been just great. We've had a really close working relationship with the orchestra, which has been very rewarding. And we're looking forward to a similar close working relationship with the San Diego Symphony as we prepare to reopen the Jacobs Music Center. We go through a process called commissioning a hall where we actually tune and balance the various acoustical elements that are in the space. And that process really helps bring out the sound of the orchestra and helps the room reflect what are the unique qualities of the ensemble that makes or calls a specific space its home. You mentioned Cincinnati. We went through that process with the Cincinnati Symphony Orchestra. And we also did the same thing with the Milwaukee Symphony. And it's a great process of working with the orchestra, working with the music director, and just learning, helping the orchestra get the measure of a space and learning how to play it. It's just like when an orchestral musician gets a new instrument, they have to learn how to play it. And so they're getting a new instrument in the form of a concert hall. And this process is what helps them learn how to play it to best advantage.
Well, you are no stranger to our hall, Tecate Symphony Hall, Jacobs Music Center. You've seen its history, you know its history. And when we first began to talk about it, you were excited about an opportunity to improve the acoustics, both for the musicians and the audience. So talk to us a little about this mystery or a science or a combination of mystery and science of acoustics first before we get into the details.
Sure. Well, acoustics is very much an art and a science. There's a lot we understand about the physics of how sound reacts in enclosed spaces, in concert halls and theaters and opera houses. But there's also a measure of art to what we do, and that's about striking subtle balances between different acoustical qualities. A lot of acoustical qualities sit on a teeter-totter. So, for example, transparency and blend are two qualities that sit on sort of the opposite ends of the spectrum. And so you can have a hall that has tremendous transparency, so much so that you can hear individual string players playing, but then it sounds more like 105 a soloist on the platform rather than an ensemble. Likewise, you can have a hall that's so well blended that you find it very difficult to be able to discern those individual voices in the orchestra. You know, when you want to hear that, you know, oboe solo or the French horn entrance, you need to be able to pick those out. So the art comes in striking a balance between those sorts of qualities, having both a good sense of transparency so you can hear the inner voices of the orchestra, but enough blend that it sounds like an ensemble rather than a bunch of soloists.
So I remember talking at the beginning about so many good values of the sound that we have here in Jacobs Music Center. There's a great deal of color in the sound. There's a good reverberation. There's a lot of character to the sound. And yet there were some challenges as well. Shall we start with the stage itself?
Yeah, I think that's a good place to start because, as you rightly pointed out, fall does have a very pleasing sense of reverberance, and it does show off the different colors of the orchestra very effectively. But the things that we discovered as we started talking in greater depth with Raphael and with the orchestra were the difficulties that they experienced hearing themselves and hearing each other, so that they could give their best on the platform. They often felt like the platform was holding them back and keeping them from being able to give their best. And so as we delved into that problem, what we really understood was that the ceiling over the musician's head was really much too low and was making it very difficult for the musicians to hear what was happening in the room, in the larger room. And it's important for musicians to hear two, what we call streams of information, or sonic information. One is what we call or refer to as early reflections. And these are the sound reflections that arrive to the musicians from surfaces that are quite close to them. The walls right adjacent to the platform, the overhead canopy panels over the stage. Those things help with rhythmic precision. So the sense of rhythmic ensemble, the orchestra playing in lockstep with one another from a rhythmic point of view. But all of the other aspects of the sonic quality of an orchestra, things like intonation and balance, blend and pitch, all the cues for those types of qualities, those qualities in music, come from the late energy, what comes back from the concert hall itself, from where the audience is sitting. So in Copley Symphony Hall, the old shell ceiling was so low that it made that early energy too intense and made it hard for them to hear what was happening in the room. And so a big piece of the renovation project sought to open that up and create much more acoustical breathing room around the orchestra, allowing them to hear themselves and each other in a whole new way, which will give them opportunities to grow and develop as an ensemble under Raphael's leadership.
So we did that in part by opening up the proscenium arch and removing that crossbeam, which has successfully been concluded, which is great.
Yep.
And in part by, as you said, installing these new reflectors at a much higher level. Can you talk to us? I'm sorry, but a third factor is that we had a demountable shell before. It could be moved and stored away. And that meant it had to be lighter. And we have a permanent fixed shell that is heavier in terms of the reinforcement of the sound from the shell itself.
That's correct, right? The old shell was lightweight so that it could be stored away. The new shell is a permanent fixed element. It's a piece of architecture, actually, and it comprises much heavier materials that are designed in particular to support the warmth of the orchestra, the double basses, the cellos, the contrabassoon, the timpani, the bass drum, all of those instruments that work at the lowest registers of the orchestra need solidity, need mass to be able to support their sound and reflect it out to the audience. And so the new walls of the permanent shell will provide that kind of solidity, that mass that's necessary to reinforce the bass in the room and give it a rich, warm sound quality. Likewise, the overhead canopy panels are rather more sophisticated in their design. You may remember from old photographs of Copley Symphony Hall that the panels that were over the musician's head were very simple flat panels that bridged all the way across the stage. What you'll see in the new design are individual elements that are separately suspended and separately adjusted so that we can adjust the pitch, the height, and the attitude of those panels in 3 dimensions to be able to carefully direct energy, some of the energy back to the musicians to help them hear themselves, the lion's share of the energy out to the audience so the audience can fully appreciate what the musicians are doing on stage. And the curvature, what you'll notice about these elements is that they're curved in both directions so that we're able to direct energy both across the stage and up and down stage to be able to facilitate those hearing conditions, both from the front to the back of the orchestra, as well as from side to side. And that's really important to getting that sense of ensemble character to an orchestra's sound.
So let's talk about those panels. What are they made of? How are they designed?
They're actually a fiberglass material. In effect, you can think about them as being a sophisticated boat hull. And the shaping of that was something that we worked really closely with John and his colleagues at HGA to develop. So you see one of them in the mold right here, in the final stages of preparation. And John, maybe you want to jump in here and talk a little bit about that process?
Sure. Hello, everyone. Nice to see you all again. So as we were developing those reflectors, it was a really close choreography between ourselves, Paul, and our theatrical consultant, Schuler Shook, both to address the acoustic properties that Paul has been describing, but also allow the integration between those reflectors of lighting positions and other kind of technical additions to the hall. So the design of them, when you see them up close, they have kind of a slight kind of curved shape, both in the underside, as Paul was describing, to really give us that a higher level of tunability in terms of the way it moves sound left and right and forward and backwards, but also the edges of it are curved slightly as well. And then you can see when you look at this up really closely that there's some, I think what Paul, you described once as kind of micro shaping in them. So you see all those little kind of divots or depressions in it. And so what we did there was we worked with Paul to understand kind of the right scale for those. And so Paul, you might be able to describe this even a little better than me, but it as opposed to having kind of a single flat surface that might provide a little bit more of a slab of sound, this kind of does a light diffusion of it.
Exactly. So the big curves help provide the broader scale diffusion for mid and low frequencies, while this finer scale articulation to the panels, the little scalloped shapes or divots, as John referred to them, helps diffuse the highest frequencies to keep the highest frequencies of the orchestra, the upper harmonics of the violins and the upper percussion, or the percussion and some of the woodwinds, to help keep their sound from getting brittle and harsh, which can happen when the surfaces are not articulated or too flat.
And they have a beautiful texture, but also have a special coating at the end, a decorative element, John?
Yeah, so what you see here, this is actually really fascinating. This is the machine that actually carves those surfaces and creates those kind of micro depressions that we were talking about. But then what we've also done with those depressions is they vary slightly in height, both to enhance even this diffusion, but also what we've done to integrate it visually into the rest of the hall. Those will actually subtly reflect the patterns and textures of other details within the hall. So when you look up at this array of 20 reflectors, you'll also see the shapes, forms, and characters that exist in the rest of the hall reflected in the micro milling of those surfaces. And then the color we're looking at is going to reflect as well some of those lighter, brighter tones, some of the kind of gold and kind of bronze tones that are in the hall as well. So it's both a balance of the kind of visual character of the hall with this new higher level of acoustic tuning that we're bringing to the space.
Yeah. And one of the this is one of the probably most exciting aspects of the design from a certain perspective, because one of the challenges that contemporary architects have is how do they develop this level of fine scale diffusion in a language that's frankly contemporary and up to date, rather than simply replicating, the cornice moldings and the egg and dart moldings and the other sort of ornamentation that is present in historic halls and does all those things for us by virtue of the ornament. And what I think John and his colleagues have done is really come up with a very fresh contemporary take on providing this level of diffusion, and yet still reflect it. They're still harken back to the historic vocabulary of this wonderful room. So it's going to be a really beautiful marriage of science and art that's happening on the stage.
Let's talk again about the enclosure. So what we're seeing here is a beautiful reflection on a wire mesh, but that's really not the acoustic part. The acoustic part is what you don't see. Is that correct?
That's correct. The mesh is actually a sound transparent element. We worked again very closely with HGA to develop the mesh, the diameter of the elements that make up the mesh, their spacing, to ensure that it actually is a sound transparent element. And then in effect, that provides a visual screen behind which we can deploy all the elements that we need to provide diffusion, reflection, in some cases a little bit of sound absorption, or in some cases a lot when the orchestra is doing something amplified. So it allows us to conceal all of these elements and present a face to the audience that is unified and is consistent. So when you walk into the space, you'll always have the feeling that you're in the same space. It's not changing as we manipulate curtains or other elements behind the scenes to create the acoustic character that best serves the orchestra and the audience.
So if I remember correctly, there's roughly what, 3 feet, 36 inches behind the wire mesh to the back wall,
That's about right. Mhm.
which gives, if you're the brass players playing in the back row, which gives you're not right up against that reflective surface. It gives.
Exactly, because one of the challenges that we've had in the room is to create as much playing space for the orchestra as possible on stage, because it is a little on the tight side. So we wanted to make sure that the orchestra could take maximum advantage of the space that was available. And one of the ways that we could do that is by making sure that the rear wall in particular behind the orchestra was not the actual acoustical reflecting surface, but in fact is actually set back about another 3 feet further back. That gives the timpani, the percussion, the brass, the French horns, the kind of acoustical breathing space they need behind them that allows them to comfortably sit right up next to the visual wall, even though the acoustical surface is set a little bit further back to give them that breathing space.
There are two things that happen in that 36 inches. One, as you said, is some drapery, because we do films that with amplified soundtrack, or we have other genres of music that don't really want that much reverberation. So we can change it.
That's right. At the stage level, there are curtains that can draw across that acoustical surface behind the mesh. And then behind the choral seats and above the choral seats, those big mesh walls above and behind the chorus can also have draperies that come out of hidden pockets and cover the walls behind the mesh. Again, so you won't see it change character acoustically or visually, but it will change the character of the stage space significantly from an acoustical point of view and allow these other types of events to be much, much more successful.
And then you've been talking about this deflection of sound to the audience so that it isn't all directly coming off, but it's reflected in different ways. There's also a bit of magic back there that helps do that.
Yeah, we have these diffusive elements. They're castings actually, and they're put in a pattern behind the screen on that hard surface that forms the acoustic boundary of the space. And what we're looking for in that case is a very irregular sort of surface. So the best way I could describe it to a contractor was to make a cow pie. And so we've come to refer to these colloquially as cow pies, and they're literally this kind of this rounded shape that has some irregularities to its surface texture that helps to break up and diffuse the sound. And here's a picture of a drawing that shows how the contractors have interpreted our request for this element. And they'll make about 96 of these that will be scattered behind the stage and behind the walls of the orchestra floor at the audience level. And they'll take them as they're putting them on, and there will be subtle variations in the spacings between them. And we will also tell them to rotate them randomly. So some of them will be as the one in the upper left is deployed. The next one over might be rotated 45 degrees so that its dimple appears in a different place in relation to the rest of the casting. And that helps to randomize the diffusion and make it even more, make the effect of the diffusion smoother from an acoustical perspective.
So that's a very good assessment of the stage. I should also say that the stage we are designing risers for the stage. And maybe you want to talk a little bit about that system.
Sure. We found that it's incredibly important for the orchestra to be able to have visual lines of sight between one another, and as a result, also then have aural lines of sight between themselves. And that allows them to hear each other much more effectively. So the new riser system at Jacobs Music Center will elevate all but the stands of violins, violas, and cellos that are right closest to Raphael at the podium. But the rest of the orchestra, all of the percussion, the brass, the woodwinds, the rear stands of strings will all be elevated. The other thing that does is it create lines of sight between those musicians and the audience as well. So it helps the audience to hear the orchestra when they're sitting on the orchestra floor. It helps the audience to hear the orchestra better because they when you can see the first oboe player and see them begin to do that entrance, it becomes easier for you to hear and hone in on that solo passage as it comes across.
Which is a perfect transition to the audience. Obviously, the better the musicians can hear themselves, the better the performance, the more the audience receives of that excellence. But we've also particularly transformed the main floor with shape and depth and the parterres, and also more or less the last row of the upper balcony.
Right. So on the orchestra floor, the big change is bringing the back wall of the audience much forward, 7 or 8 rows, so that back wall is much closer to the stage. That does a couple of things. It eliminated the seats that were furthest under the overhang, which were most disadvantaged by being deep under that overhang. It also makes the reflected sound from that rear wall coming back to the stage arrive a little bit earlier, where it can be supportive of what the musicians are doing on stage. And finally, it will increase the sense of envelopment. The sense of the sound is all around you as a listener when you're seated on the orchestra floor. So it's doing a lot of things for us. Up at the balcony level, we've reprofiled the curving rear wall behind the audience at the top of the balcony. In a much earlier renovation of the hall, that surface had been treated with sound absorbing material because it tended to produce a fairly sharp echo back to the musicians on stage, which was very distracting and made it very difficult to play with good ensemble, because that echo was kind of a distinct second image of the sound that arrived really late back to the stage. So what we're doing now, instead of absorbing that sound and taking it away from the mix, what we're doing is we're putting another band of that beautiful architectural mesh, that John talked about a little while ago. And then behind it, we're concealing a very aggressively shaped or articulated surface that again provides diffusion. So it takes that sound and scatters it back to the audience. And so here's an example of how it does that. So you see the reflection as it goes up to the ceiling, reflects off the wall, and then that diffusive surface scatters the sound so that it contributes to the sense of the people in the upper balcony being immersed or being surrounded by the sound of the orchestra.
And there are also absorptive surfaces behind that mesh in the audience as well.
Correct. There's a set of draperies actually behind all of the meshes on the orchestra floor and at the balcony level and in the angel walks on either side of the balcony that allow us to deaden those surfaces and absorb sound. Again, when you're doing a different genre of music, something that's amplified, and you need a crisper acoustic to allow that amplification to sound articulate and crisp and clear for the audience.
And William Zauscher, who is showing you a nice fly-through of the hall right now, there you can see that that area that we're talking about and coming straight down to the stage. I have to say, standing on those parterre steps, which now we have about 5 levels poured, you're standing just behind the new cross aisle, which has also been created and poured. The connection to the stage is remarkable. It feels like you're really connected to the musicians. Also, that seating area is curved so that you're angled slightly toward each other. So it's a much more a sense of community. We have new hallways, sound and light locks to prevent sound from the lobby areas coming into the hall. But I remember early days when we sat and listened to the hall in its old setup, the ambient noise, the level of white, I'll call it white noise, that you have probably a better name for it, was not insignificant, shall we say. And simply by moving the HVAC and everything up to above the hall, not touching the hall, but little lights and fans, all of that is getting cleaned up as well.
That's correct. The new ventilation systems, which are being installed in the penthouse above the auditorium, have been designed from the ground up to be quiet. So the actual noise that the air handlers produce is lower than the old systems. And then the ductwork has all been very carefully designed to make sure that none of the noise produced by the fans actually makes its way into the auditorium. Likewise, we're looking at all of the lighting systems, the new lighting systems. As we all know, LED is the new way that we light everything these days. And that's great from an energy conservation point of view, but it also means that you have to be very careful about how you deploy it, because many of those lighting systems have fans associated with them to keep the electronics cool. And so we have to vet those fixtures one by one to make sure that they either don't have fans or that the fans can be defeated externally so that they don't introduce noise into the space. And what that does is it will create a much quieter background environment for the orchestra to paint its sonic picture. If you think about it, an orchestra can only produce so much sound. It maxes out at a certain point, before, you can only force a brass instrument to go so loud before it begins to break up. Same with a woodwind instrument, a violin, a cello, double bass. They all have their practical limits in terms of how much sound they can produce. So if that maximum is a fixed quantity, the only way you can extend the expressiveness of the orchestra from a dynamic point of view is to lower the noise in the room. So the difference between the loudest things and the softest things that an orchestra produces is greater. And it's that difference in dynamics that really communicates a lot of the emotion in music. My partner, Chris Blair, here at Acoustics, likes to say that the majesty of music resides in the crescendo, but the mystery in music resides in the silences and near silences. So that's why focusing on that is such an important thing.
I can't wait for that. For me, the near silence is the magic in music, and the repertoire that Raphael is choosing to open the hall, I can tell you, will expose and enlighten us to that for sure.
Yeah.
We're going to take questions in about 2 minutes, so please put them in your chat. We are happy to answer any questions today that you have that we can. And Paul, just in closing, and John, the relationship between an architect and an acoustician is critical in any construction. I think from my perspective, I can say that the relationship that you have is strong and collaborative and that of respect, but maybe talk a little bit about how one bends to the other and vice versa.
John, you first or me?
You go ahead. I'll play off you.
Well, I first of all, the first thing to note is, of course, that HGA has a deep well of experience with performance buildings. So they came to the table with a real sense of respect for what we were bringing to the table and a real openness to our ideas and our approaches to the design of the renovations for the Jacobs Music Center. And likewise, I feel very strongly that the best designs result from a seamless integration of acoustics and architecture. So I hate walking into a room where your instant reaction is, oh, an acoustician's been here. I can tell because every surface has been manhandled in some awful way in the service of acoustics. And so I come to architectural design with a real sensitivity towards the aesthetics and how the aesthetics and the acoustics have to work together, because in the end, a great architectural design will only serve to enhance the acoustical experience. It's an aspect of what we do called psychoacoustics, where the other senses come into play to reinforce what happens with the acoustics in a space.
Well, and I'll say, having you go first here, Paul, I think, understanding from the get-go, talking with you in the symphony, the goal of this project was to improve the acoustics. And so understanding what Raphael was hearing, what the musicians were hearing, what you were seeing and hearing was critical to our design process and how we think about making an architecture that integrates these things. Because in a building like this, really, our role as architects is to respect that incredible building that you all have, as well as to hear literally what the feedback you and others are giving us. And that's really where we start in our process. And to me personally, that's where I find the practice of architecture is really fulfilling. Sometimes you have a blank slate. Sometimes you actually walk into the room and you have some really, really strong dance partners. And this project, we absolutely had that. And it's nice. It's nice to have that kind of that lead and that kind of back and forth relationship. I think in this project, it's really informed solutions that balance all of those things and create this kind of beautiful synergy between the hall, the acoustics, and the visual additions that we're making to the space.
Mm-hmm.
And I should say, you've mentioned the musicians many times along the way, but the involvement of musicians and you listening to their concerns and to their wish list, as it were, all through the process, with acoustics and the backstage support being at the core of this. I think that's taking that into consideration at all levels and understanding their experience and responding to it. I know you've done that for a long time, but you certainly, from my perspective, it was such a priority in this, which I appreciate. Mm-hmm. And then the historic nature of the hall, which we wanted to preserve, and the fidelity to that. We have some really good questions. I'm really anxious to hear the answer to this one. In your opinion, what will be the new best seat in the house?
Well, my answer to that question is always, it depends on what you listen for in music, because there are some people who love to sit in the first row of the orchestra floor. Now, I would never sit there. That is not a seat that I would gravitate towards. But for people that love that physical intimacy with the performer, I understand why they want to be in that seat. I will tend to gravitate towards seats in the front row of the balcony because that's a sonic quality that I like. And it's also a visual quality that I like. I like looking down on the orchestra a little bit to be able to see the music course through the orchestra, see a theme introduced in the first violins, get handed off to the violas or the cellos, and then be picked up by the woodwinds and the brass. It's exciting to watch the music move through the orchestra. Of course, one of the exciting new things about the Jacobs Music Center is that there's going to be a new opportunity for seating around the stage. When those choral seats are not sold for a chorus, members of the audience will be able to sit in those seats and experience the orchestra in a whole new way. Be able to watch the conductor and all the forms of communication that happen between a conductor and their ensemble, which is not just about that baton or the hands, but the raised eyebrow, the subtle smile when a performer nails that solo that they've worked so hard on in rehearsal. What I encourage people to do is to in that first season to sample a lot of different seats and find the seat that engages them the most, where they feel most connected to the orchestra, most connected to the music, most thrilled by the experience.
I think that's really good advice. I love that. I love that experience myself. What acoustical changes will the average listener first notice when you're at a concert, when we're at our concert at the new Jacobs Music Center? What do you hope that first impression will be?
I think what you'll notice first is that there's a lot of the old hall there in the sense of the wonderful reverberance, the wonderful sense of blend. I think what you'll hear that's new is a greater sense of clarity and cohesion to the ensemble, because they'll be hearing themselves better. They'll be able to make music in a new and different way. So I think the way that the ensemble comes together, you'll hear that very, very dramatically in the new space.
Did we encounter, both of you, any challenges during this part of the renovation that required an unusually creative solution?
Yeah, a lot of them, right? Working in a building like the Jacobs Music Center, I mean, is it once both rewarding and can at times be frustrating, because when you open up a wall and you discover something that wasn't on the drawings from 1929, but we've been able to achieve so many of the goals that we set forward at the outset of the process that it's been a wonderful experience. But certainly it's had its challenges, removing the columns at the upstage wall to be able to create a choral terrace that actually really works, and there William is sharing with us how they were removing those columns just a few weeks ago.
Yeah, John, maybe you want to talk a little bit. That was the incredible feat of the last 2 weeks, and they are now gone, and 8th Avenue still stands. So you want to talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, that was, I think of two really big feats in this renovation, just in terms of kind of structural architectural heroics. The first is work that we talked about a little bit in the last conversation, but it was really novel, and I think it bears repeating, and Paul alluded to this a moment ago, was the ability to hang all the acoustics from the parking structure above us, which is really novel. I don't know of any other project that's been able to isolate the acoustics that often come up off mechanical systems in the way we've done that here, which is just going to be an incredible benefit to the acoustics in the hall, and took a lot of negotiating, obviously, with your partners and neighbors, but as well as just figuring out and managing how we would actually do that. And then the second was the removal of the valance, the red valance that everyone remembers across the top of the proscenium. Behind that was a large piece of concrete, about 12 feet tall at its highest point in the middle. And so that entire area there has been removed. And I think that's something that visually people will notice right away when they come in. It's going to really drastically change your sense of intimacy in all parts of the hall, especially at the balcony level, where you'll be able to see deep into the space that the performers, that the orchestra is positioned, which is going to really be a striking difference. And that required us to create a whole new beam to laterally transfer the loads that were part of that wall over to the sides of the stage house. And then, as Paul was mentioning, the columns at the back of the stage, or the upstage wall, those columns actually support the entire back of the stage house, as well as your sidewalk outside on 8th Street. So the beam that runs now across the back of the stage is equally tall. I think it's about a 10-foot tall beam that runs across, and it transfers all those loads. And that's what's allowed the team to create the opportunity to have, I think we can provide about 80 choral members on that stage, or about 75 audience members. And all of these heroics all are in the service of creating all these different levels of acoustic enhancement, as well as audience intimacy that we've been talking about. All these things are things that folks may not notice at all when they go in, but they're all the kind of exciting things that are kind of behind ultimately what you'll see when you come into the hall that have made all of this possible.
Seeing those videos of the stage, we now have the stage is poured. We have a stage again. What wood is going to be used for the flooring of the stage? Do you have that specification yet?
Yeah, the flooring will be a white oak floor. And we've brought out samples, and the performers have been able to stick their picks into that floor, the picks at the end of their instruments, to kind of get a feel for how that will feel. And it's the color tone will be, if folks remember, some of the woods that are in the existing lobbies, which are not being changed, the wood tone will be a little bit warmer, a little bit browner, less of that red that just some of you might recall was on the stage before. The stage floor was kind of a strong red, so it'll be a little bit more of the kind of warmer wood tones in that white oak.
And last question, how will amplified sound be affected by the new acoustics of the hall? We talked a little bit about it, but
Sure. Well, the old hall didn't have any ability to manipulate its acoustics, or at least not very much. So when you started to do amplified performances in it, it very quickly became muddy and indistinct and not clear at all from an amplified sound point of view. With all of the new drapery systems that are hidden behind the mesh screens at the orchestra floor, in the angel walks, behind the balcony, on stage, we'll now be able to reduce the resonance of the room by a huge degree and make amplified sound be much more successful. So when the orchestra does a film with orchestra accompaniment, you'll be able to get the clarity that you're looking for with the spoken word soundtrack that comes with that film. Likewise, when there's a different genre of music, contemporary music that's heavily amplified, those sorts of concerts will come off much more successfully, because the amplification system will have a crispness to it, an articulation to it, that's been really difficult to achieve in the past.
great. Well, this was a fascinating conversation, doesn't surprise me at all, with the two of you, and such a rich subject. Thank you for being here. And thank you to all who are viewing this today or will view it in the future. We are happy to continue these conversations and bring a little bit more to light as we go forward in the year to come. The date today is November 1st, and I'm anticipating a year from now, we're going to know. We're going to have heard the first sounds, which is very exciting.
Fantastic. Thanks.
Thanks everybody for being here. We'll see you next time.
Good to see you.